and the people of God, this amazing woven cord, one of the threads to emerge in recent decades, is something that we call new monasticism. And it's a phrase that's used a lot. It's something which we identify with as a community. But you may possibly not be fully sure of quite what is meant by that. And so for our first session this morning, Penny, Brother Cassian are going to take us into what this is.
Wonderful, thank you. It's so lovely to be with you all this morning again and to share, and also with you folk at home. Welcome. So what is new monasticism? And Simon has described it as one of the threads that have begun to emerge. I want to explore that a little bit this morning. I love roots. So when I hear a word that I don't know so well, or a word just suddenly pops up, I want to know where it comes from. What does it mean? What's its source? It's fascinating. And the same with these threads, the new monasticism. What is its root? Where does it come from? And I wonder actually whether it is a new thread or whether actually it's a very ancient thread. We've put new on the front. It's a new expression of something that is very ancient. Simon also said in the beginning that the growth that we're seeing happening in the community and in many other communities like ours is something that seems to be right out of our hands. It's something extraordinary, isn't it? And to me, that's such a beautiful thing. You know, as we were worshipping this morning, that sense of Christ, Christ above, Christ beneath, Christ behind, Christ within. This is about Christ. It's not about our plans. It's not about our action plans, our development plans, whatever other hideous phrase you want to use that makes me come out in a sweat. This is about walking with Christ. Recently, I was at a conference and there were people gathered from right across Europe. And it's always fascinating to be with European brothers and sisters and to discover our connection with them. When we're used to meeting folk from the States, from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, people who kind of, the white people who come from us, let's put it that way. But to be with our European brothers and sisters is fascinating. And talking with them, this is people from Estonia, Latvia, Germany, Finland, mostly Northern Europe actually. Every single one expressed that desire that there must be something more. There's that aching longing within so many people today. That deep aching longing, there must be something more. And I guess we all feel it because, or have felt it, because that's why we're here, isn't it? We've felt that desire for something more. It's not just our church, it's not just our denomination, whichever your denomination is. There's an aching longing. There's an interesting, I hesitate to call it a fact, but it's what's come to people's notice that society goes in cycles, and it appears to be 500-year cycles. I'm not going to go back too far because, you know, my knowledge of dates before Jesus is pretty rough. So I'm not going to go back that far. I just knew that certain things happened, but I couldn't tell you what dates. After, so looking after Jesus, there appears to be something of a 500-year cycle. So I'm going to miss out the first 500, but after, at 1,000, see, I don't do numbers, I'm very sorry. At around 1,000, we have what we call the Great Schism, and that wasn't just a theological dispute. It was a huge cultural change, a massive change in society, of empires, of where things were ruled from, of who was in charge. It was a massive cultural change, a political change, and a theological change. And it didn't just happen suddenly, it builds up like a big wave, and there's a crest and over it goes. 500 years after that, we have the Reformation. And it wasn't just the moment when Luther pinned the articles on the church door. There was massive changes going on, changes in science, which changed the way people read and understood scripture. Suddenly, they said the world wasn't flat anymore. When the world was flat, when Jesus rose and you rose, you both went to the same place above. When the world is round, Jesus went up over there and you go up over there. So how does that work? Now, to us, that's just daft because we're so used to thinking about things as a globe. For them, it was catastrophic. Suddenly, the way you read scripture was completely different. It was a huge cultural, emotional, physical, scientific, and theological change. And you have to begin to work out, so who's in charge in these times? And, you know, we decided that actually the Catholic Church wasn't in charge anymore. And, you know, we needed a different way, and Protestantism arose. We're on that wave again. Things are beginning to change. We're getting near to the cusp of that wave, I guess, or perhaps we're right on it. We're aware of things changing a great deal. The last 3 years have seen enormous change. There's something very big going on. Pandemic, economic crisis, climate crisis. It's huge, and it's out of our hands. And it's for us to walk with the Spirit in this. So what is happening here? And I want to start by telling you a little story. I don't often talk about my own stories, but I just thought that perhaps this one was maybe helpful. When I was about 15, I have a very, very vivid memory of being with my brother on his small holding in mid Wales. And we were digging a field. He didn't have a lot of money, so we did it with spades. A little field, it was hard work. But in that moment, and I can feel it within me, there was this sudden, massive desire in me. I want to live like this. I want to be close to the earth. I want to live simply. Now, at that stage, I lived in a fairly conventional urban setting. Okay, it was on the edge of a town in Surrey, so there was countryside around, but it certainly wasn't a country dweller. But there was this huge desire in me that I could not interpret then. It was overwhelming. And all I can feel was a real sense of sadness that I could never have that unless I could find a farmer to marry. I didn't find a farmer to marry. I found somebody much better than that. But it was huge, that longing. And as I look back, that longing is so significant, that desire. A few years later, I was so fortunate in my mid-20s to meet with my first soul friend, and she was a sister in the Community of the Holy Name. And she walked with me for 12 years. And she led me into a deeper commitment. She led me into a way of life and a rhythm of prayer. Now, I don't think I ever told her about this desire in me for a simple way of life and to be close to creation. But she understood the deep need for commitment and to be grounded. She led me into a rhythm of prayer and a way of life long before I became a member of this community. And I see a very similar story in the foundation of our community, interestingly. Our community was not begun as a monastic community. We didn't hear about new monasticism and think, oh, that's a good idea. We ought to do that. Then we might get some growth. It didn't happen that way. It began with a longing for something more. Mike Mitten describes, I'm not sure if it's in the book, Restoring the Woven Cord, or whether it's something I've heard him speak, but he spoke about how he was deeply involved in the renewal movement, and Ray and Ross Parker with him. But a lot of the renewal in those days was coming from the States. Nothing wrong in that, but it wasn't ours. Our liturgy kind of came from Rome for those of us in traditional churches. It's not really ours. Our saints were mostly Middle Eastern. Nothing wrong with them at all. Pretty foundational to us, but they're not ours. There was that longing for something more. And at the same time, there was that desire for a deeper, rooted, grounded way of life, of commitment. And I think those two things are very, very significant. The desire, the longing, the calling, call it what you will. I like to call it a longing because for me, a longing is something passionate, whereas a calling can perhaps, in my mind, be a little bit more academic. It needn't be, but I like the word longing. But it's something that's so important for us all. The longing and the commitment. Now, interestingly, to be human is to have longing. To be a creature is to live with longing. When you breathe in because you long for the oxygen and the gases we need, and then we breathe it out again. And then you've got to breathe in again. It's always there, that longing is a part of who we are. Our longing, our desire, our need for food. We eat, we expend the energy, and then we need to eat all over again. But in our culture, we've become fixated with satisfaction and gratification, and we don't understand longing anymore. And I think it is that longing and desire is the root of our walk as new monastics. New monasticism is a recognition of the longing. There must be something more. And I think that longing, that desire, that calling is God-given. And then we need the response to that desire, which is to go deeper into God. It doesn't necessarily satisfy the desire. Not necessarily. There are moments, aren't there? And as I stood this morning with the worship, there was that moment of, yes, I know here. That moment. But the longing is still there. And I guess all of you can feel that. That longing is a part of our call. It's a part of how we're made, and we're beginning to uncover that. And across all of society, not just amongst the Christians, there's that desire. There must be something more. We need to hear that longing. Part of the root of monasticism is the way of life. And the foundation of that is simplicity, purity, and obedience. Way back in the very early centuries, previous to Benedict, in the Desert Fathers, and with the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and Cassian, they wanted to live a way of simplicity and purity and obedience. Simplicity reminds us that we're creatures. Why is it we're called to simplicity? Because we're not called to gratification all the time. We're called to that longing. Simplicity reminds us that we're creatures, and to have just enough is enough. It's to live with our hands open rather than closed. You know, we're tired of getting more. Society is tired of getting more. People are tired of working harder and harder and longer to have more. We ought to have more. You know, our UK society, European society, Western society is built on progress, and progress means having more. And something in our soul says, I can't take any more. I don't want more. We need to let go. We long for our hands to be open and released. And the way of simplicity, it's God-given. It's not an action plan to make us effective. It's God-given, this simplicity. We're born to long and desire. Let's not be afraid of it. Let's live with it, enjoy it. And those moments when we just feel with a whole being, yes, are God-given gifts. And we come back to that beautiful, beautiful hunger for God. Purity. My wonderful soul friend that I have now, who's been with me for 20 years now, she's an Orthodox nun now. She used to be an Anglican solitary, and she had a desire for more and gradually found her way into becoming an Orthodox solitary. But she always says to me, purity, Penny, is our desire for God. And I understand that now. Purity is our desire for God, not the way we behave. It's that desire for God that is the gift of God. It's when we start to gratify it humanly that we give in to our greeds and our lusts, that we lose the purity. Purity is our desire for God. We may strive, we will strive humanly to satisfy that longingly. We will do it. We all do it. Purity is to know that deep longing for God above all else. And then obedience. Obedience is that deep, attentive listening. Listening. Not listening so you can make conversation. Not listening so you can learn stuff or have clever answers. Just listening and see what comes. I had somebody come to me a little while ago who'd had a fallout with another member of their congregation. It happens. And she was very hurt and very wounded by it and struggling to forgive. And she took a long time before she felt able to come and talk about it. We had a nice cup of coffee and some cake together. And I sat and listened to the story. And I didn't make any comments. I didn't make any judgments on either side. I just listened. And at the end of it, she said, "Oh, thank you so much for all you've given today." And I thought, well, that was easy, wasn't it? I had cake and coffee and not much else to do. But listening, to be listened to, is so healing. And don't we all know it? Those moments when you've been profoundly listened to. But what happens when we do that with creation? What happens when we just listen? Just watch. Just so that we might listen and watch and be open. I think of Kevin and the blackbird that Simon told the story yesterday, and him there with the blackbird in his hand for a few weeks, and the inconvenience of that. Just listening, just being there for that bird. We had a tame blackbird, called Cedric. I don't know why that was his name, but he was called Cedric. And we had him for 2 years. He was around. He'd probably been around for longer than that. And then last year he disappeared. So I guess he probably died. But he would come down and land in my hand. It was wonderful. And one day, I don't know if any of you saw the television program. What was it called? The Simple Life. Some of you saw it. So it was filmed down the road from us, and it was about people who took on an Amish way of life for a few months. So they quite often come up past our gate. We met the Amish people a few times, but we met the folks who were part of the project many times. And one day I was standing at the gate talking, like you do in the countryside. You lean on the gate. We've got a proper good wooden 5-bar gate that you can properly lean on, which is like that, and have a good yak over the gate. And as I was standing there, Cedric came down and landed in my hand. And she said, "Wow, is he yours?" I said, "No, he very definitely is not mine. He's not mine. He's his own." And to me, that's part of the listening. It's just being there, listening, that loving attention to each other, to the stranger, to creation, that loving attention. That is what obedience is. And aren't we just longing for that? Just to be subject to subject with each part of creation, with each other. Simplicity, purity, and obedience. This is the foundation of monasticism. And it's the foundation of new monasticism. And that, in a sense, is why we're here. We're longing to find this way, to feel and know our longing, and then to enter into that deeper commitment that draws us ever deeper into Christ. The labels will come and go. Maybe in 10 years from now, new monasticism will be old school. But I think our way of life will continue on, because to me, this feels like something that is very, very deeply rooted. This is Christ at work in our midst, highlighting our longing, highlighting the longing that there is in all of society, right across the world, and highlighting our desire to live simply, to live in purity, to live in obedience. Brother Cassian, take us on from here.
More genuflection.
I think if we didn't have that longing that Penny was talking about, none of us would be here. It is that longing in the core of our being that there must be something more, something deeper. The new monastic concept, movement, longing, whatever you want to call it, is a growing concept. This background, in case you're interested, is me sitting in the cloisters of Caldy Abbey, where Father Gildas lives. So I thought I'd bring a little bit of Father Gildas here, even if he couldn't come himself today. It's something that I like to talk to other people about, because it's something that I have been so deeply moved by, and has been such an incredibly significant part of my own journey. But getting across the concepts of what new monasticism is, or what is new monastic, is quite tricky. It's difficult. we're all sitting here today and we've listened to Penny and her wonderful thoughts, and maybe we'll get to the end of this session with what I've got to share as well. We'll all go, yes, I get that, because actually we've kind of already got that mindset. So I want to tell you a story about an experience that I had a few years ago. I was privileged enough a few years ago to be leading the first voyage vows of Joyce, who is with us now as Sister Mary Bethany, because she's become a monastic voyager as well. And we have some mutual friends. And one of those mutual friends, I was giving a lift to the first voyage ceremony to watch Joyce take her vows. And she didn't really know what she was coming to. She was a friend of Joyce and wanted to go to see this. It was something specific and meaningful for Joyce, so she wanted to be part of that. So in the car journey on the way out, she was asking me about it. So I was talking about this new monastic community that I was part of and that Joyce was part of as an explorer and was taking vows into. And so there, I was just talking in the same way as I'm talking now about this kind of new monastic community, but she didn't know what that meant. And so her brain was trying to fathom what I was talking about. And even though I was saying new monastic, because she didn't know those words and what they meant, her brain was trying to work out what I was saying. So I was saying new monastic. She was hearing new monastic. I'll just get out of the way of the camera. And she said, I know that the word pneuma is the Greek word for spirit in the New Testament, so it must be something to do with the Holy Spirit, but I don't know what nastic means. What does nastic mean? And after a little bit of a giggle and an explanation, she understood that I wasn't saying new monastic, I was saying new monastic. But like Penny, I love words. I love etymology. And so I thought to myself, I was paying attention when I was doing your vows, Joyce, Sister Mary Bethany, but in the back of my mind was the thought, I wonder if nastic is a real word. And so when I got home, I looked it up to see if it was a real word. Do you know what? It is a real word. Do you know what it means? Nastic is a term that comes from botany. It's the slow movement of plant parts in response to either external or internal growth stimuli. Nastic means to grow slowly from an internal or external stimuli. Isn't that wonderful? So therefore, new monastic means to grow slowly, spiritually, from external or internal stimuli. So I was talking about new monastic. But this is what the longing is about. Slow spiritual growth through external, which is what we're doing here, and internal, the direct relationship with Christ and the Spirit and the Trinity within us, stimulating us on in our journey. Monasticism from its beginnings to the new monastic, not new monastic, but new monastic expressions, moves at a slow pace, not at the pace of our modern culture. It moves at nature's pace, because spirit and nature is interwoven. Simon yesterday was talking about attributions of quotes, and there's one particular person, particularly from the Eastern or Oriental persuasion. If any quotes or anything comes up, if anyone doesn't know where it comes from, it's normally attributed to Lai Tzu, who's one of the founders of Taoism. So basically anything that people don't know where it comes from, particularly Eastern and Oriental, it's traditionally attributed to Lai Tzu. So one of those quotes that has no foundational, primary source, but it's attributed to Lai Tzu, says, nature does not hurry, and yet everything is accomplished. We need to get back into the rhythm of our natural selves, our spiritual selves. But I want to share some thoughts from myself and from others about what new monasticism is. Because what we want to do is get to the end of this session and hopefully each one of you, if someone asks you, what is new monasticism? What is a new monastic community? You will have a response to give if you don't already have one. So in preparation for this, I'm part of various different new monastic based Facebook groups. Some of them Celtic, some of them other. And so I posed this question. I'm doing a talk at a conference next month, and it would be really helpful if you could answer the following in a brief statement. I emphasized brief because some of them don't understand that word. The question was, what is new monasticism? And I'm going to share some of their answers with you in a moment, and then share some of my own thoughts. But I want to start with some thoughts from a guy called John Michael Talbot. He's a fantastic guy who runs the Brothers and Sisters of Charity in America. And he wrote this book called The Universal Monk, The Way of New Monastics, which is a fantastic, the whole book is great, but I'm just going to read the first couple of paragraphs from the introduction. There is a new monasticism on the rise. It is a monasticism for everyone, for all states of life, for people of all faiths even. It is for those who live in monasteries and for those who do not. It speaks to the monk within us all, the universal monk. But it also calls those who long to live in monasteries and to those who already do. From it, the Spirit is raising new monasteries up for our time. Much like the early monks of Egypt, this is a charismatic phenomenon of the Spirit. It is a result not merely of good ideas, but of the Spirit stirring within people's hearts. The Spirit is calling us to something more than what is normally available in the parish church or the secular world. Like the first Christian monks of the desert, this stirring of the Spirit cannot be stopped or manipulated. It is a sovereign work of God in the hearts and the souls of people, but it can, at least to some degree, be described. The essential characteristics of these new monasteries is the contemplative life for all people in all states of life that overflows into action that changes the world for the better. These communities become workshops of prayer that is tested and tried in some form of community life. It is in the solitude that we find deeper meditation and contemplative union with God. It is in community that the authenticity of that union is tested and tried. When the two come together, they are called communion or common union. That form is based on ancient monastic patterns, but is adapted to modern life. And the rest of the book goes on in just as good a way. So what is new monasticism? According to a variety of different people, it's one of those phrases where if you ask 10 people, you get 12 answers. So let me move out of the way of the screen so the camera can see the screen. I don't know if that's going to be any good for them. Anyway, it's quite small writing. New monasticism, this is the answers that were given on the Facebook pages, is a diverse movement, not limited to a specific religious denomination or church, and including varying expressions of contemplative life. An attempt to bring the positive aspects of monastic life into everyday lay living at home and work. It's a movement exploring ancient Christian forms of spirituality and lifestyles conducive towards seeking God. Practices of contemplation, reflection, inner calling, service, long-term commitment, and the search of union outside of monasteries. A commitment to Christ, embracing all denominations who follow a rule of life. It's a coming together of monastic spirituality integrated into an active lifestyle within work and family. No more separating from the world, rather living in the world as a monk alongside a community. Communities living in some sort of common rule of life, generally not associated with a traditional denomination or order. That's about how I describe it. Well, it's kind of like old monasticism, but fresher. Thanks for that. It's very helpful. Excavating the tradition for hidden gems and using them as the foundation of a new vision for the monastic vocation. Drawing from tradition to live a new way in the modern world. Live simply so others may live. Heard that before. Monastic practices, making monastic practices accessible to the laity, and a mature discussion of their purpose and action is certainly an element of new monasticism. New monasticism is deconstructing the monastic contemplative tradition and delivering it in digestible pieces to very, very hungry sheep. A life-giving, committed rhythm of connecting with God, sharing life with others, living hospitably and wrestling with questions together. Returning to a place, position, or post which may be costly and sacrificial to you or your family, that allows you to give back to the community or organization something that may be seen as a lesser or menial task because of age, wisdom, or experience. You bring a depth of expertise and knowledge that is invaluable. All must be done as an act of humility and servanthood. A version of monastic life that is applicable to our time and culture. For me, it means a commitment to a way of life within a spiritual community that holds specific values and beliefs. Common beliefs might include prayer, work, or right living, or right livelihood rather, and community, as well as caring for the earth and its resources. It is valuing life over power or greed. It's living in harmony with seasons and people who may have different beliefs or cultures. It can mean a dispersed group such as the community of Aidan and Hilda, or might be an actual monastery where one would live year round. New monasticism responds to people's longing to make the kind of commitment that traditional monastics made, where everything in their life is connected to their spiritual quest for God. But at the same time, they don't want to leave the world. It's open to people who are both married and single, people who want to make a serious commitment to God, who want to align all the aspects of their lives and bring that into prayer. Most new monastic communities emphasize the following: thoughtful, prayerful, and contemplative lives, communal life expressed in a variety of ways depending on the community, a focus on hospitality, and practical engagement with the poor. This is from my friend Kevin, who is one of the founders and leaders of what's now the Companions of the Holy Spirit, which used to be called, until very recently, Kindling Fires. This is from their website. New monasticism is a movement among many churches and traditions, seeking to revive the church through discipleship and prayer in a similar way as traditional monasticism. Historically, monastics would live in isolation as hermits or in secluded communities within monasteries. In fact, the term monastic comes from the Greek term monos, one or alone. Unlike traditional monastic communities, however, new monasticism seeks to bring discipleship and prayer back into the world rather than retreating from it, especially considering the recent decline in church. So those were the thoughts of numerous other people who are involved in various other new monastic communities. My own thoughts of what is new monasticism, which is a question we're going to throw out open to the floor shortly, so you can be thinking about that while I just round off here. I've put some thoughts into this book, The Art of Peace, with a couple of quotes. And I was going to quote from these books, but I thought it's just easier. I've already looked for them and found them and put them in here. So I'm just going to read here and hold the book up when I read the quotes. New monasticism is a movement of lay people who are finding benefit in creating life with a framework of a monastic rule or way of life. Similarly to the traditional third orders, new monastic orders or communities are made up of people living out their chosen monastic rule in their usual everyday life. Unlike the third orders, they do not directly link with traditional first orders, such as the Franciscans or Benedictines. New monastic communities create their rule from other sources. The new monastic community that I belong to, for example, the community of Aidan and Hilda, creates its way of life from gleaning what we can from the historical Celtic monastic rules from the 4th to 9th centuries in Britain and Ireland. New monastic communities envision a community, this is a quote, in which the devotional disciplines that nurtured the radical spirituality of traditional monks are reinterpreted so that the Christian community can participate in the performance of the melodies of God in the midst of contemporary society. And that's a quote from this book, The Melodies of a New Monasticism, which was a gift to me from Bishop Christopher Coxworth 3 years ago when I stood in this very spot and took on the habit. There is change afoot, a shift happening in the consciousness of many. Stuart Burns from Mucknell Abbey says, "The era of Christendom is over. However much many church-going Christians may not recognize or wish to admit it, by the Middle Ages, church and state had become twin pillars, but this is no longer true. And the great institutions of that era are now crumbling, if they haven't already disappeared. We are on the threshold of a new era. A new paradigm is beginning to emerge. These expressions of Christian new monasticism are attempts to live the Christian gospel with fresh integrity." And that's a quote from this book. I will have these books with me at the workshop this afternoon, so you can have a look through them if you come along for that. Back to my thoughts. This paradigm shift comes as part of a natural 500-year-ish rhythm of structural change in the universal church. Someone just said that, I think. 500 years from Christ, I'm going to go back that far, was the rise of the Latin church throughout Europe, particularly exemplified through Gregory the Great, and the decline of Celtic monasticism, or beginning of decline of Celtic monasticism. 500 years after that was the Great Schism. 500 years after that was the Reformation. 500 years after that is today. Unfortunately, if you go back to these 500 years paradigm shifts in church, it takes about 100 years from beginning to end. So we're at the beginning of this shift. So none of us are going to be around to see how it turns out. But I'm very excited to be at the beginning of something new. Like the Desert Fathers and Mothers who we met in the previous 2 chapters, people are feeling the need to escape the mainstream institution called church, as they are finding it that it is not giving or living what is needed, sometimes not even living the gospel of Christ at all. But still being Christ-centered in their own spiritual life, they're finding a home and an affinity within new monastic communities. These are non-residential communities, meaning that when one joins the community, one doesn't move into a monastic center, but they understand that the world is their monastery. But this isn't necessarily an either-or situation. You don't have to choose between traditional church or new monasticism, although some have done. But just as traditional monasticism has always been connected to the universal church, yet outside of it, so new monasticism wishes to create a catalyst of difference in life attitude and expectancy of Christians living to what might be presented, living differently to what might be presented in traditional modern church teaching. New monastic life is a life following the calling that we have in the core of our being, a longing. Like Penny, the term calling can really be quite a closed, clinical thought and idea. You can have a calling to all sorts of things, but something deeply spiritual within many, many people, if not every person, There is a longing to do something, to connect more deeply. And monasticism has always been the way of doing that. And in all the paradigm shifts throughout the last 2,000 years, in fact, there's a lady called Phyllis Tickle, great name, she's a doctor as well, Dr. Tickle, who is the kind of the source of this 500-year rhythm information from her books on the emergent church movement and conversation. She died a couple of years ago, unfortunately, but she said in an interview I saw her in that she was giving this talk, giving this 500-year shift idea in a talk, and went back to Christ. And the rabbi came up to her and afterwards and said, actually, it's not a Christian thing. It goes beyond that, because 500 years before Christ was the exile, Babylonian exile. 500 years before that was the Davidic kingdom, the beginning of the Davidic kingdoms. And then 500 years before that was when the Israelites were taken in slavery in Egypt, into 400 years worth of slavery in Egypt. So actually, it's just a natural cycle, it seems, at least in the Judaic-Christian rhythm of living. But what Phyllis Tickle also says is that from the very beginning, there has been something underpinning these paradigm shifts, so that when the whole structure changes, it doesn't collapse, something that hasn't changed since the 3rd century, and that's monasticism. Since the beginnings of monasticism in the late 3rd century, where the Asceticon was written, the first rule of life before Basil the Great wrote his rule, it's basically been the same all the way through. Subtle changes here and there. That's why you have different expressions of monasticism from the Benedictines and the Cistercians and the Franciscans and the Trappists and the Carmelites. Subtle changes and differences, but basically the same. And new monasticism carries on that legacy, that real sense of depth. And that's what we want to do. That's what we want to live. That's what we are called to. That's what our longing is, or at least that's what my longing is. And this is how I find a sense of belonging in that longing. So I'm going to invite Penny to come back up. We may have to take the microphone out of here, because otherwise it'll make a lot of noise lifting up and down. And really throw that open. Well, let's go back to that slide. Throw that question open to folks who either might have questions to ask or might have answers to give. We don't have a roving microphone, so you'll have to shout and maybe repeat the answers.